World War I was probably the closest thing to hell that mankind has ever created in history. The living conditions in the trenches were horrible in themselves, as you would be constantly sitting in the mud, underfed, with gigantic rats biting you in your sleep, never knowing when the next assault or artillery bombardment will come. And the fighting was nothing short of hell on earth. With 80% of casualties inflicted by artillery, you'd most likely be ripped from existence in a flash of fire and steel, without even having seen the enemy. And that would happen before you even left the comfort of your trench. A century later, it is hard for us to imagine what an entire generation of men has been through and how traumatic World War I has been for an entire continent. In this video, I will try my best to explain why our generation, Gen Z, wouldn't survive World War I. Part 1. European society before the war. Before we even talk about the war in itself, we need to understand how society at that time was different from modern Western society. In fact, I would argue that society before World War I was the exact opposite of ours. First, let's talk about values, as they directly dictate individual and collective actions. In today's world, the individual is put on a pedestal and should be prioritized above the collective, which sole purpose should be to give the greatest comfort to the individual. Material comfort is everyone's main goal, risk and pain should be avoided at all costs, hierarchies are all viewed with suspicion, rights come before duty, if duty even exists at all. European society before World War I was the exact opposite of that. In European society at the time, the individual had to completely submit to the collective, whose ultimate purpose was to become the strongest possible. Complete submission to the hierarchy was mandatory, whether that hierarchy was the state, the church, the father, or the nobility depending on your country. Duty came before rights and very often involved sacrifice, whether working 12 hours a day in a mine as a 13-year-old or going to war without questioning its reasons. Now, let's talk about work. If you are living at the time, you'd most likely work in a factory, in a mine, or in a field for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. You would be exposed the entire day to chemical products, to toxic fumes and dust. Accidents were a frequent occurrence and will lead to amputation or even death. If you'd injure yourself at work, your boss will never be responsible, you will lose your income overnight, be fired immediately, and have no social welfare to back you up. Child work was also very common, especially in the mines. They often had to do the most dangerous tasks at 10 or even 8 years old and would be paid half as adult men for the same working hours. Women were paid significantly less than men, sometimes for the exact same work. Strikes were very common and you would go hungry to defend your cause, and they would often be brutally repressed by the police or the military. It is very safe to say that a modern European would not recognize World War I Europe at all, and vice versa. Part 2. The War. World War I has become the archetype of total war, which is actually a very rare occurrence in history. Total war is a form of warfare in which a nation mobilizes all available resources. The distinction between civilian life and the war effort becomes increasingly blurry. The entire industrial infrastructure is mobilized to feed the never-slowing down war machine. Women and children are expected to work gruesome 12-hour shifts in the factories and in the mines. Meanwhile, if you were a young man in his 20s or late teens, it was extremely likely that you would be sent to the front lines regardless of your feelings. Your life and your existence as a human being would become nothing more than a resource to consume and burn for strategic purposes. Today, many historians describe World War I as nothing short of a mechanized hell on earth. Millions of soldiers, many of them barely out of adolescence, were thrust into mud-shocked trenches, living alongside rats and the corpses of their dead comrades. The artillery fire never stopped. Days of deafening shellfire, random gas attacks, and the looming threat of the next assault. Many died without ever seeing the enemy, torn apart in seconds or slowly bleeding out before even having left the trench. Sleep was rare, food was cold and filthy, and mental breakdowns were common, known then as shell shock. Numerous cases of hallucinations were also reported, as the sleep-deprived and traumatized young soldiers would see monsters crawling in their direction before realizing it was only a horribly mutilated corpse. Soldiers never allowed themselves to fully relax, as they had to be ready to react in a heartbeat as soon as artillery fire resumed, which was very frequent. They were also terrified of gas attacks that could happen at any given time and fate them to a horrible death if they failed to react fast enough. Now, notice that we've only talked about what happens when you're still in your trench so far. We've already described what kind of living hell these soldiers have been through, but when the assault started was when the horror truly began. Once the order was given, you had to leave your trench in order to reach the enemy's trench, the two being separated by a few hundred meters. This gap between the two trenches was called the no man's land for one good reason. Once you step foot on this place, you are most likely going to die. Before you even started to run, you had to avoid barbed wire and the mines that were protecting your trench, along with all the corpses that they've left behind the previous weeks. When you started running and got closer to the enemy's trench, a storm of fire and steel would start raining on you. Machine guns delivering up to 600 shots per minute and heavy artillery fire could kill hundreds of your comrades in a few minutes only. Sometimes, thousands and even tens of thousands of soldiers would die within minutes after the attack started. The soldiers described that the sound of the battle was a truly horrifying experience. The artillery fire was truly deafening and it would leave hundreds of soldiers screaming in agony after having lost one or several limbs. Some soldiers even reported that they couldn't even hear their own rifle when they fired, nor even their own screams when they started to panic. Only a minority of the unlucky soldiers who had to charge in the first wave would reach the enemy's trench, and many times not even a single one would. Many historians believe that survival in these circumstances was only dictated by luck and not by competence, intelligence, and courage. And once you reach the enemy's trench, medieval-like hand-to-hand fighting would start, in which you would kill or be killed with bayonets, knives, shovels, or bare hands. If the attack failed, you had to retreat through the no man's land under heavy enemy fire, with the same odds of a horrible death as the first time you crossed it. If the attack succeeded, you had to defend the captured trench against endless enemy assaults, undersupplied and cut from any reinforcement, which would be as dangerous. If you survived all of this, then you would go through the same thing again, each time with the same odds of a horrible and absurd death. And between each assault, you would go back to the same living conditions we've described before, for years. With all of that being said, it is safe to say that World War I was probably one of the worst experiences a human being has ever been through. Part 3. After the war. You'd think that after having been through such horror, it could only get better afterwards, but that couldn't be further away from the truth. If you were fortunate enough to survive the war and come back home, you were still far, far away from escaping the nightmare. In fact, for millions of men, it was nothing but the beginning. First, let's dive into the direct continuation of the nightmare related to the war. Millions of men survived World War I only to be completely ostracized by society. When the war ended, millions of soldiers came back disfigured or having lost one or several limbs. If that happened to you, you basically become unemployable and very often rejected by everyone. Veterans from World War I or any war for that matter very often reported no recognition at all for the sacrifice, and they felt that they have been through such horrible suffering for nothing. Even if you came back uninjured from the war, you still weren't exempt from trauma, anxiety, insomnia, or flashbacks. Many veterans became alcoholic, violent, or withdrew from any social interaction, and many even killed themselves in complete indifference. But even after that, the nightmare was still far from over. Even if you were to unharmed from the war and manage your mental health to the best of your abilities, many horrors were still to come. In 1918, one of the deadliest pandemics in human history began. Named the Spanish flu, mainly raging from 1918 to 1919, it is estimated to have killed between 30 million to 100 million people. This pandemic impacted the entire world and killed even more people than the war. Strangely enough, the age range that was at the greatest risk of dying were people between 20 to 40 years old, precisely the age of most of World War I soldiers. Meaning that if you are lucky enough to survive World War I, you are still facing the risk of a gruesome and early death. Many soldiers die from the flu within weeks of coming back from the front. And even if you survived that, you still weren't done yet. Many countries such as Germany, Hungary, and especially Russia experienced deep political crises or even full-blown wars. The Russian Civil War, raging from 1917 to 1922, killed an additional 10 million people, making it one of the deadliest civil wars in history, almost as deadly as World War I itself. Other wars, such as the Polish-Soviet War, the many separatist movements in the former Russian Empire, or the Turkish War of Independence against the former World War I allies were also going on at the same time. As you see, peace wasn't actually the new normal after World War I. And even if you survived World War I, the Spanish flu, and the many wars that came after that, you still weren't done yet. You still had to face the Great Depression, the rise of fascism and communism, famines, purges in Eastern Europe, and eventually a new world war that would kill even more people. As you can see, World War I, despite being one of the most horrible things man has ever been through, was nothing but the beginning of the amount of suffering a human being can go through in a single lifetime. So this is why I believe Gen Z would struggle hard if it had to face World War I and its aftermath. I actually don't believe that our current age will be remembered as a bright one, but it still could have been much worse. Try to see this video as a reminder of how worse your life could have been under different circumstances. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe and share. And if that is your will, I'll see you in the next one.